My name is Charlotte Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my professional life, people have described me using words that sound polite, but mean something smaller than they appear. Reliable, supportive, easy to work with, behind the scenes. I work in corporate project operations in London, which is a polite way of saying I'm the person who makes sure complicated things don't fall apart. The schedules, the documentation, the communication threads that stretch across 3 time zones, those were usually my responsibility. Not the glamorous part of business, not the visible part, but the part that everything else quietly depends on. Still, if you had asked most people in my department who I was a year ago, they probably would have given a simpler description. Charlotte? Oh, she's support staff. And to be fair, that's what it looked like. I was the one taking notes in meetings, the one sending the follow-up emails, the one who stayed quiet while other people spoke with much more confidence than preparation. I learned early in my career that sometimes the easiest way to stay employed was to let people underestimate you. Not because you're hiding something dramatic, not because you're waiting for revenge, but because explaining yourself to people who have already decided who you are rarely changes their minds. So I stopped trying. For months, I watched the small patterns that make up office life, the little ways respect gets distributed or withheld, the jokes that land a little too comfortably, the moments when someone speaks over you and no one corrects them. None of it looked serious enough to call out, and that's exactly why it kept happening. The story I'm about to tell you isn't dramatic in the way most workplace stories are told. No shouting matches, no grand confrontations, no sudden, cinematic revenge. If anything, the most important moments in the story happened quietly, a sentence repeated in a hallway, a meeting where someone decided I wasn't necessary, a detail that everyone overlooked, and eventually, a single meeting that didn't begin until I joined the call. Because as it turns out, the same manager who spent weeks telling everyone I was only a support staff member had accidentally built an entire project that couldn't move forward without me. But this story isn't about humiliating anyone. It's about what happens when people misunderstand the difference between being quiet and being powerless. And sometimes, they only realize the difference when it's already too late. So before we begin, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people decided who you were before you ever had the chance to show them otherwise? If you had walked into our office 6 months ago and asked who Charlotte Mercer was, you probably wouldn't have gotten a very detailed answer. Most people would have paused for a second, searching their memory, and then said something like, "Oh, Charlotte, she helps with the project documentation." Or sometimes, "She's part of the support team." No one said it with cruelty. That's the interesting part. It wasn't malicious. It was just accepted. Labels in a workplace have a strange way of settling into place. Once they're there, people stop questioning them. And my label had been decided a long time ago. I was the person who made sure things ran smoothly, but never the person anyone expected to lead them. I was the one preparing the meeting materials, not the one presenting them. The one sending summaries afterward, not the one whose opinions shaped the decisions. It didn't happen overnight. It rarely does. When I first joined the company, I came in with the same ambition most people bring into corporate life. I asked questions. I offered suggestions. I volunteered ideas when something looked inefficient. But over time, something subtle began to happen. When you speak in a room, and your suggestion is met with silence once, you assume people were distracted. When it happens twice, you assume the idea wasn't strong enough. When it happens a dozen times, you start to understand the room. People weren't ignoring the ideas, they were ignoring the person delivering them. And gradually, I adapted. Not out of bitterness, just practicality. If people already saw me as the one who organized things, then organizing things was what I focused on doing exceptionally well. I built systems, quietly. Our team handled multiple large client projects at the same time, and the information flow was chaotic when I arrived. Files scattered across drives, meeting notes lost in email chains, decisions made verbally and forgotten a week later. So I started documenting everything. Every client requirement, every process update, every timeline shift, every promise someone made during a call. At first, it was just for my own sanity. I needed a way to keep track of things. But over time, that small habit grew into something larger. I created structured documentation folders, cross-referenced meeting notes, linked technical decisions to project timelines, built internal reference guides so that anyone joining the project could understand the full history within minutes. None of this was glamorous work. No one congratulated me for it. In fact, most people barely noticed. But slowly, the team began relying on those systems. When someone forgot what a client had requested 3 weeks earlier, they would ask me, "Charlotte, do you remember what they said about the compliance requirement?" And I would open my notebook. When someone couldn't find the latest project timeline, they would message me, "Charlotte, do you know where the updated file is?" And I would send the link. When a client referenced a previous discussion that no one else remembered, I would quietly pull up the record. Over time, something strange happened. People began to rely on me for answers, without ever reconsidering the label they had given me. Support staff. It was comfortable for them to believe that, because the moment they asked a deeper question, why does Charlotte know everything about this project? They might have realized something uncomfortable, that the person they thought was simply supporting the work had actually been holding the structure of it together, but most people never look closely at the systems they depend on, especially when those systems are maintained by someone quiet. And my manager understood this dynamic better than anyone. In meetings, he introduced me the same way every time. "This is Charlotte. She handles support operations for the team." It sounded harmless, professional even, but labels shape expectations. And expectations shape how seriously people listen. So when decisions were being discussed, people looked toward the senior managers at the table, not the quiet woman sitting slightly to the side, writing things down in a black leather notebook. To them, I was simply documenting the conversation, not shaping the future consequences of it. But there was one detail no one realized at the time. The systems I built weren't just records. They were infrastructure. And infrastructure has a strange property. No one notices it, until the day it becomes impossible to operate without it. The first moment I remember clearly didn't look important at the time. That's the thing about certain turning points. They don't arrive with a dramatic pause or a room falling silent. They happen in small, ordinary moments that everyone else forgets almost immediately. But for some reason, you remember them. Ours happened during a Monday morning project call. It was one of those routine internal meetings where the team reviewed updates before speaking with the client later that week. About 10 people were on the call: project managers, a technical lead, my manager, and a few analysts. I had spent most of the previous Friday organizing the documentation for a new compliance requirement the client had added unexpectedly. It wasn't a small change. The adjustment would affect the implementation timeline, the data structure, and several deliverables that had already been promised. So that morning, when the topic came up, I spoke, not loudly, just clearly. "I think the compliance update affects the integration schedule," I said. "If we move forward with the current plan, we'll probably have to redo part of the reporting structure." There was a short pause, not disagreement, just the kind of silence that appears when someone speaks, and the room decides not to engage. Then my manager, Daniel, continued the conversation as if nothing had been said. "Right," he said, turning toward the technical lead. "So let's keep the timeline as it is and see how things develop." The discussion moved on. No one acknowledged my comment. No one asked a follow-up question. No one said it was incorrect. It simply vanished. I remember looking down at my notebook and writing the sentence again. "Compliance change will likely impact the reporting structure." I didn't bring it up a second time, not because I was embarrassed, just because experience had taught me how these things worked. Meetings have momentum, and sometimes a comment from the wrong person gets absorbed by that momentum without leaving a trace. 2 days later, during the call with the client, the issue resurfaced. The client mentioned the compliance update again and asked whether it would affect the reporting architecture. There was a brief moment of uncertainty on our side of the call. Then Daniel said something that sounded strangely familiar. "Yes, actually," he said. "We realize the compliance requirement may impact the reporting structure. We're reviewing the timeline to account for that." I didn't react, not outwardly, but I noticed something small in that moment. No one questioned where the realization had come from. No one said, "Didn't Charlotte mention that earlier?" The idea had simply been absorbed and reintroduced from a different voice. Again, not malicious, just normal. Corporate conversations have a way of redistributing credit without anyone consciously deciding to do it. After the call ended, the team moved on to the next topic. But I stayed for a moment after the meeting closed, staring at the note I had written 2 days earlier. It wasn't anger I felt, more like clarity. a quiet understanding of the rules of the environment I was working in. Ideas mattered, but who delivered them mattered more. And in that room, my voice simply didn't carry the same weight, so I made a small adjustment. I stopped trying to push ideas into conversations where they would disappear. Instead, I began documenting them more carefully. Dates, decisions, recommendations. Not because I expected anyone to read them, just because something about that moment made me want the record to exist somewhere, even if no one else ever looked at it. At the time, it felt like a minor habit, a way to keep things organized. I didn't realize yet that this quiet habit of writing things down would eventually become the one thing no one else in that office had: a complete memory of the project. And in environments where people rely on memory more than documentation, the person who keeps the record often understands the situation better than anyone else in the room. But that realization came later. For now, it was just a small moment. A sentence spoken. A sentence was ignored. A sentence repeated by someone else. The first small cut. After a while, something interesting happens when small moments like that repeat often enough. You stop reacting to them, not because they stop being noticeable, but because they become predictable. In the weeks after that meeting, similar situations kept appearing. None of them was dramatic enough to confront. None of them was obvious enough for anyone else to call out. But together, they formed a pattern. One afternoon, during a planning session, the technical lead was trying to recall a requirement the client had mentioned 2 weeks earlier. Everyone looked slightly uncertain. I checked my notebook. They asked for the data export to include historical records going back 3 years, I said. That was during the Thursday call. The technical lead nodded slowly. That sounds right. Then Daniel leaned back in his chair and said something that made the room laugh lightly. That's why we keep Charlotte around, he said. She remembers everything for us. It sounded harmless, even friendly, the kind of comment people make casually without thinking much about it. But the laughter in the room carried a subtle message. I wasn't the person contributing insight. I was the person providing reminders, a living archive. And once a role like that settles into people's minds, they stop seeing anything outside of it. The strange thing was that I didn't argue with it. In fact, I leaned into it. Because the more I paid attention, the clearer the structure of the team became. Daniel liked speaking in meetings. He was confident, articulate, and very good at presenting ideas with authority. The senior analyst liked offering strategic suggestions, especially when clients were present. The technical team preferred to focus on implementation and avoid too much discussion. And me, I was the person who made sure nothing got lost between those layers. At first, I wondered if I should try to change how people saw me, but that question disappeared after a particular meeting in late autumn. We were discussing a complicated integration step for the client's reporting system. Several people were debating different approaches, and the conversation was getting tangled. I had already mapped the dependencies the night before while reviewing documentation, so I spoke. If we separate the data pipeline before the reporting layer, the compliance changes won't affect the original architecture. There was a pause. Then Daniel smiled politely and nodded. Let's circle back to that if needed, he said, which in meeting language usually means we won't be circling back. 10 minutes later, the technical lead proposed almost the exact same approach. Suddenly, the room became interesting. That might actually solve the compliance issue, someone said. Daniel leaned forward. That's a good direction, he replied. I didn't interrupt to point out that the idea had already been mentioned, not because I lacked confidence, but because I had begun to understand something deeper about how recognition worked in that environment. It wasn't about accuracy, it was about position. And trying to force recognition rarely changed the position someone had already assigned you. So instead of correcting anyone, I simply wrote down the decision. Integration pipeline separation approved. Next to it, in smaller handwriting, I added a note, originally suggested earlier in the meeting. That line wasn't for anyone else. It was just part of the record. Over time, those records grew thicker, pages filled with observations about how discussions unfolded, who spoke first, who repeated ideas, who received credit, not out of resentment, more like quiet research. Because once you start observing patterns in human behavior, you realize something surprising. Most people are incredibly consistent. They repeat the same conversational habits, the same assumptions, the same blind spots. And once you see those patterns clearly enough, you can often predict how a situation will unfold long before anyone else notices it happening. By winter, I had stopped trying to reshape my role. I let people see me exactly the way they already did. Reliable, organized, quiet, support staff. But privately, I had begun to understand something important. When people assume you're only responsible for supporting the work, they rarely notice how deeply you understand the structure of it. And the deeper you understand the structure, the more influence you quietly gain over what happens next. At the time, though, none of that influence had been used. I was still simply observing, still documenting, still allowing people to believe the story they had written about me. But that story would soon become much more important than they realized. Because one day, that label, support staff, would quietly collide with a very inconvenient reality, and the room would finally have to reconsider who I actually was. By the time winter arrived, the role I played inside the team had become very clear to everyone, not because anyone had officially described it that way, but because people reveal their expectations through small, repeated behaviors. And mine had settled into something extremely specific. I was the person who made everything run smoothly, without ever being part of the spotlight. If a meeting needed organizing, I handled it. If the client requested documentation, I prepared it. If someone needed a record of what had been discussed 2 weeks earlier, they asked me. It was a strange position to occupy. On paper, it looked minor, quiet, administrative. But in reality, it meant that almost every piece of information in the project passed through my hands at some point. Still, no one described it that way. The official label remained the same: support. Daniel reinforced that perception constantly, usually without realizing it. Whenever a new client joined a call, introductions followed a predictable pattern. This is Mark, our senior analyst. This is Elena, our technical lead. And this is Charlotte, he would say casually. She helps us with project support and coordination. The word always helps land gently in the conversation, like a soft cushion placed under the sentence. Helpful, supportive, reliable. None of those words sounds negative, but they quietly define the boundaries of how seriously someone is expected to be taken. If you're the one helping, you're not the one deciding. And the interesting thing was that no one in the room questioned that framing. Not the clients, not the analysts, not even the new employees who joined the team later that year. They accepted the introduction exactly as it was presented, and I didn't correct it. Because by that point, I had already noticed something. The more clearly Daniel framed me as support, the more comfortable everyone else became relying on me for everything else. It showed up in subtle ways. People stopped searching for files themselves and simply asked me where things were. They forwarded client questions directly to me when they couldn't remember earlier discussions. Sometimes they even asked me to clarify decisions that had been made in meetings I technically wasn't leading. One afternoon, a junior analyst stopped by my desk, looking confused. "Charlotte, quick question," he said. "Do you remember what the client decided about the compliance reporting format?" I opened my notebook. "They chose the version with historical data included," I replied. "Oh, good," he said with relief. Daniel couldn't remember, and the client's asking again. Moments like that happened constantly, and each time, the same quiet contradiction appeared. Publicly, I was supportive. Privately, people relied on me as if I were the memory of the project itself. But there was another part of the role I had been assigned: invisibility. During strategic conversations, I was rarely addressed directly. When leadership meetings happened, I wasn't always invited. When decisions about timelines or client commitments were made, they were usually discussed above my level. Yet somehow, the documentation for those decisions still landed on my desk afterward, which meant something unusual began happening over time. I saw every decision, but I wasn't responsible for any of them. And that position, seeing everything without being expected to control it, created a perspective most people on the team didn't have. Because when you're responsible for defending a decision, you tend to focus on justifying it. But when you're simply documenting it, you start noticing patterns, promises made too quickly, assumptions repeated without verification, timelines that looked confident in meetings but unrealistic on paper. None of these things felt urgent at the time. Projects always have minor inefficiencies. People make optimistic plans, adjustments happen later. That's normal. But one particular pattern began appearing more often than the others. Daniel had started making promises to the client that depended heavily on the documentation systems I had built. Except he never described them that way. To the client, it sounded like the team had organized everything perfectly. In reality, the structure behind those promises lived almost entirely in my files, and no one else had ever taken the time to understand how those systems actually worked. At the time, that detail didn't seem important. It simply meant I was busy. But looking back now, that was the moment the situation quietly became fragile. Because if a system is built around one person's work, and everyone assumes that person is replaceable support, eventually those two beliefs collide. And when they do, the consequences rarely unfold the way people expect. For months, nothing about my situation felt urgent. The patterns were clear, but they were stable. People underestimated me, relied on my systems, and moved through their work without thinking much about the structure underneath it. I documented things. I organized information. I stayed quiet during conversations that weren't really meant for me. It wasn't dramatic, just predictable. And in many ways, predictable environments feel comfortable. But the shift came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Not during a meeting, not during a conflict. Just a quiet moment that changed the way I understood my position. That week, the client had requested a large progress review. Daniel wanted to present a clear overview of the entire project: timelines, integrations, compliance updates, and reporting architecture. Which meant, of course, that most of the preparation work landed with me. I spent 2 days compiling documentation. Every decision, every update, every change in scope. It was the kind of preparation work I had done many times before. Nothing unusual about it. Late that afternoon, while organizing the presentation materials, I stepped away from my desk to refill my coffee. As I passed the conference room, I heard voices inside. Daniel was speaking with 2 senior managers from another department. The door wasn't fully closed. I wasn't trying to listen, but certain sentences have a way of reaching you anyway. One of the managers asked a simple question. "Who built all these project documentation systems?" Daniel answered almost immediately. "Oh, that's just Charlotte," he said casually. "She's support staff. Very organized." There was a short pause. Then the other manager asked, "So if she wasn't here, could someone else maintain the structure?" Daniel laughed lightly. "Of course," he said. "It's not complicated. Anyone on the team could pick it up." I kept walking, not because I was upset, but because something inside me had gone very quiet. It's a strange feeling when you hear someone confidently describe your work, especially when they clearly don't understand it. I returned to my desk and sat there for a moment. The screen in front of me showed dozens of linked folders, documentation pages, internal references, and decision records. What Daniel had called not complicated, but I knew exactly how complicated it was, because I had built it piece by piece over the past year. Every cross-reference, every system dependency, every connection between client requests and technical implementation. The project didn't just have documentation, it had a living structure. And I was the only person who truly understood how all the parts fit together. Not because I wanted exclusive control, simply because no one else had ever taken the time to learn it. For the first time, I asked myself a question I hadn't considered before. What would actually happen if I weren't here? Not as a threat, just as a thought experiment. I opened the main project index. Hundreds of entries, client decisions, compliance adjustments, technical dependencies, meeting records stretching back months. All of it is interconnected. Daniel was right about one thing. Someone could technically take over the system, but they would first have to understand it. And understanding it would require something most people in that office had never done: pay close attention. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it gave me clarity. For months, I had been adapting to the role people assigned me: support, reliable, invisible. But that afternoon, I saw the situation from a different angle. If the systems I built were truly as replaceable as Daniel believed, then my position was fragile. But if they weren't as simple as he assumed, then the project itself might be more dependent on me than anyone realized. I didn't confront him. I didn't correct the comment. I didn't even mention the conversation. Instead, I did something much quieter. I opened my notebook, and for the first time, I began documenting not just what happened in meetings, but what would the project look like without me inside it. Not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, just curiosity. Because sometimes the most important shift in a story isn't something that happens in the room. It's the moment someone quietly changes the question they're asking themselves. And from that day forward, I stopped asking how to fit into the role I'd been given. I started asking something else entirely. What happens when the system they depend on suddenly stops being invisible? After that afternoon outside the conference room, something about my silence changed. Before, it had been adaptive. Now it has become deliberate. The difference between the two is subtle, but important. Adaptive silence comes from reading a room and deciding it isn't worth pushing against the current. It's practical, efficient. You conserve energy. Deliberate silence, on the other hand, comes from understanding the current so well that you choose not to disturb it. Because sometimes the current is carrying people somewhere they don't realize they're going, and interrupting it too early would only warn them. In the weeks that followed, I didn't behave differently in ways anyone could easily detect. I still organized documentation, still sent follow-up emails, still sat in meetings with my notebook open, recording decisions and timelines the same way I always had. But internally, my perspective had shifted. Instead of trying to participate in the conversations that shaped the project, I began studying them more carefully. The promises Daniel made to the client, the assumptions analysts repeated from earlier meetings, the technical dependencies were mentioned casually without checking the documentation. It wasn't difficult to track these things, because the structure of the project lived inside the systems I maintained. Every decision left a trail. Every promise created a dependency somewhere else. And slowly, a quiet pattern emerged. The client believed our project infrastructure was highly organized. Daniel presented it that way in every meeting. Our documentation system allows us to track every stage of implementation, he would say confidently. The team has everything structured. Technically, he wasn't lying. The structure did exist, but the team didn't understand it. Not really. They used it the way someone uses a map they didn't draw, trusting it works, without knowing how it was built. One afternoon, a new analyst joined the project. During his onboarding call, Daniel explained the team roles. "This is Charlotte," he said, gesturing toward me on the screen. "She handles support coordination for the project." The analyst nodded politely. "Got it," he said. Then he asked a question. "So if I need to understand the history of the client requirements, where should I start?" Daniel paused for a moment, then he looked toward me. "Charlotte can show you where the documentation is," he said. I smiled slightly. "Of course," I replied. Later that afternoon, the analyst and I had a short call. I walked him through the project index, the system of folders, references, and cross-linked notes that connected every major decision to its context. He was quiet for a moment while scrolling through the structure. "This is really detailed," he said eventually. "It grew over time," I replied. "Did the team build this together?" I paused for half a second. "No," I said gently. "I've maintained it." He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "this explains why everyone keeps asking you questions." That comment stayed with me, not because it was praise, but because it revealed something simple. When someone actually looked at the structure, really looked at it, they immediately understood its complexity. The problem wasn't that people would never recognize its importance. The problem was that most people had never taken the time to examine it. And as long as the system worked quietly in the background, they had no reason to, which meant the assumptions about my role remained intact. Support staff, helpful, reliable, replaceable. I didn't correct those assumptions. In fact, I became even more careful not to disrupt them. When someone repeated an idea I had suggested earlier, I let it pass. When Daniel summarized project progress without mentioning the systems behind it, I stayed silent, because by now I understood something important. The project wasn't fragile because of conflict. It was fragile because of a misunderstanding. Everyone believed the infrastructure was simple. Everyone believed the person maintaining it was replaceable. And the longer those beliefs remained unchallenged, the more surprising reality would feel when it eventually surfaced. So I continued doing my work exactly as before, documenting, organizing, observing. But now, every time someone referred to me as support, I simply nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I knew something they didn't. The strength of a system isn't always visible to the people using it. Sometimes they only realize how much it matters when it stops quietly holding everything together. By the start of spring, the rhythm of the project looked completely normal from the outside. Meetings happened on schedule. Client updates were delivered on time. Documents appeared exactly where people expected them. From the team's perspective, the system simply worked. And systems that work quietly tend to disappear into the background of people's attention. That invisibility was exactly what allowed me to begin preparing. Not dramatically, not secretly in the sense of hiding something, more like slowly understanding the full structure of something I had already built. Because once the idea entered my mind, what would happen if I wasn't here? I couldn't stop exploring it. At first, I approached it as a thought exercise. If someone else joined the team tomorrow and needed to take over my role, what would they actually need to know? The answer, as it turned out, was far more complex than anyone assumed. The documentation system people saw was only the surface layer. Behind it were dozens of small decisions that made the structure functional. Why were certain files linked together? Why were certain compliance notes stored separately? Why the client's reporting requirements were cross-referenced with technical implementation notes. Without those relationships, the documentation would still exist, but it would lose its meaning. It would become a collection of files instead of a map. And maps only work when someone understands how the terrain connects. So I began doing something I had never needed to do before. I studied my own system as if I were a stranger encountering it for the first time. Which pieces were obvious? Which pieces relied on memory? Which connections existed only because I remembered the conversation that created them? The answers were revealing. A large portion of the project's operational clarity lived in my head, not intentionally, just because over time I had become the person who attended every discussion, recorded every decision, and understood how each change affected the larger structure. That knowledge had never been formally transferred to anyone else, not because I withheld it, simply because no one had asked for it. But that realization led to another question. If the team believed the system was simple, would they ever notice if parts of it slowly became less centralized around me? So I started making small adjustments, nothing disruptive. Just subtle changes in how information flowed. Instead of answering certain questions immediately, I began directing people toward the documentation itself. Take a look at the integration index, I would say. The compliance section explains it. That sometimes people followed the link. Sometimes they came back and asked me anyway. But over time, a few members of the team began navigating the system more independently. That was good, healthy even. At the same time, I quietly strengthened other parts of the structure. The internal indexing, the historical references, the timeline connects client decisions, and technical implementation. These were areas where the system still relied heavily on my understanding. And I made sure those areas were precise, not hidden, just carefully maintained. From the outside, nothing about my role had changed. I was still the quiet person in meetings with the notebook, still the one sending follow-up summaries. Still, the person Daniel introduced was a support staff member. But internally, something had shifted again. I wasn't just maintaining the project anymore. I was mapping its dependencies, understanding exactly where the project was strong, and where it relied on assumptions no one had examined. One evening, while reviewing the project timeline, I noticed something that made me pause. Several upcoming deliverables that Daniel had promised to the client depended heavily on historical documentation, compliance verification, reporting structure validation, audit-ready implementation notes. All of those materials existed, but their accuracy depended on the cross-referenced records I had maintained over the past year, which meant something important. If the documentation lost its context, the project wouldn't immediately collapse, but it would slow down. Questions would appear, clarifications would be needed. The smooth certainty Daniel presented to the client would become harder to maintain. Again, this wasn't something I planned to cause. It was simply something I now understood. For the first time, I could see the entire architecture of the situation. The team believed the infrastructure was simple. Daniel believed my role was easily replaceable. The client believed the project's organization came from leadership. And quietly, underneath all of those beliefs, the actual structure was held together by someone they rarely noticed: me. But the most interesting part of preparation isn't the moment you understand your position. It's the moment you realize you have options. For months, I had simply observed. Now I began considering something new. If the system truly depended on my understanding, what would happen if one day the project had to operate without it? Not as sabotage, not as revenge, just as a natural consequence of assumptions that had never been questioned. That possibility remained hypothetical for a while, until one afternoon, when I discovered something that changed the situation from theoretical to very real. The moment I realized the situation had shifted from observation to something more concrete didn't happen in a meeting. It happened late one evening when I was reviewing a client request. The client had asked for a preliminary compliance verification report ahead of schedule. It wasn't unusual. Large organizations often request early reviews before official audits. What caught my attention wasn't the request itself. It was how Daniel had responded. In his email, he assured the client that the documentation was fully organized and audit-ready, and that the report could be prepared quickly using our existing project records. Technically, he wasn't wrong. The information did exist, but preparing that report required something very specific. You had to understand how the project's documentation system connected dozens of separate records. Client requests, timeline changes, technical notes, compliance adjustments. Those links weren't visible at first glance. They only made sense if you knew why certain pieces were connected. And I was the person who had created those connections. Out of curiosity, I opened the documentation index and tried to imagine how someone else would compile the report without that background knowledge. The files were there, the records were there, but the path through them wasn't obvious. Without understanding the structure, someone would spend hours, maybe days, trying to piece together the correct sequence. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the screen. For months, I had suspected that the project relied on my understanding more than anyone realized. Now I had confirmation. The project wasn't dependent on me because I controlled the information. It was dependent because I understood how the information fit together, and that understanding had never been transferred to anyone else. Again, I didn't feel triumphant, just clarity. Daniel believed the system was simple. The team believed it ran automatically. The client believed leadership had organized everything carefully. In reality, the structure existed because one quiet person had spent a year connecting every decision, file, and timeline. And if that person stepped away, the system would still exist, but its meaning would become much harder to navigate. For the first time, I understood exactly where my leverage lived. Not in authority, not in confrontation, but in knowledge. Knowledge that no one had ever bothered to examine closely. I closed the documentation window and wrote a single sentence in my notebook. The system works because someone understands it. Then I added another line beneath it. What happens when that person stops being assumed? After that evening, the situation in front of me felt clearer than it ever had before. For months, I had simply observed how the project worked. Now I understood exactly where the pressure points were. Not in a destructive way, just structurally. The project didn't rely on me because of my title. My title was still the same, support staff. It relied on me because I understood the logic behind the system that everyone else depended on. And once you realize that, a quiet but important question appears. What do you do with that knowledge? There were several possible paths. The first option was the easiest. Do nothing. Continue exactly as before. Maintain the system, support the team, and allow Daniel to present the project as if the structure behind it appeared naturally. Many people in my position choose that path. Stability has its own comfort. The second option was confrontation. I could have scheduled a conversation with Daniel, explained how complex the documentation structure actually was, asked for recognition, a revised role, or a more accurate description of my responsibilities. But I already knew how those conversations usually unfold. Not because Daniel was a bad person, just because people rarely reconsider assumptions that have worked comfortably for them, which left a third option. Not conflict, not silence, but movement. The kind that happens quietly. The more I thought about it, the more the idea made sense. If the team truly believed the system could be maintained by anyone, then the system shouldn't depend on me staying there forever. And if my work had built something valuable, then perhaps it deserved to exist somewhere it would be understood properly. That realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with a kind of calm. For the first time since joining the company, I allowed myself to imagine something different. A place where the work I did wasn't described as help. A place where the systems I built weren't invisible. A place where the person maintaining the structure was recognized as the one who designed it. That night, I closed my notebook and made a decision. Not dramatic, not irreversible in the moment, just the first quiet step in a new direction. I opened my laptop and updated my resume. I didn't mention titles the way they appeared in the company directory. Instead, I described what I had actually done: built project documentation architecture, designed operational knowledge systems, maintained cross-functional compliance tracking. For the first time, the description felt accurate. The decision wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about something simpler. If the system I had built truly mattered, then I needed to find a place where that fact didn't have to remain invisible. And once that thought settled in my mind, the next steps felt surprisingly natural. Because sometimes the most powerful move in a situation isn't confrontation. It's simply choosing not to remain where you're misunderstood. Once the decision existed in my mind, everything that followed happened quietly. Not secretive, just deliberate. I didn't change how I behaved at work. If anything, I became even more consistent. Meetings continued as usual. Documentation was updated. Client calls went smoothly. From the outside, nothing about my role had changed. But outside the office, small movements had begun. In the evenings, I started speaking with a few recruiters who specialized in operational strategy roles. Not entry-level coordination positions, but roles focused on designing the systems that companies depend on. The conversations were interesting. When I described the documentation architecture I had built, recruiters didn't hear support work. They heard operational infrastructure. One recruiter paused during a call and asked a question that surprised me. "So you designed the entire knowledge structure for the project?" "Yes," I said. "And you maintain the compliance documentation and cross-referenced decision tracking?" "I do." There was a short pause on the line. "You realize that's not a support role, right?" she said gently. I smiled slightly, even though she couldn't see it. "Yes," I replied. "I've started to realize that." Within a few weeks, interviews began appearing on my calendar. Most were exploratory, conversations about systems design, documentation strategy, and operational clarity, things I had been doing quietly for years. Meanwhile, at work, the project continued moving forward. Daniel was preparing the large compliance review he had promised the client, the same one that depended heavily on the documentation structure. Occasionally, he would ask me questions. "Charlotte, where did we store the earlier compliance notes again?" I would send the link, or he would ask, "Do you remember which version the client approved in October?" I would open my notebook and answer. Nothing about those interactions changed, but something inside me had. Because now, each time I updated the system or clarified a detail, I understood something very clearly. I was no longer maintaining this structure as someone trying to prove their value. I was maintaining it as someone who already understood it. And soon, I might not be the one maintaining it anymore. The strange thing about quiet decisions is that they rarely create immediate disruption. Life continues, meetings continue, projects continue, until one day a small announcement appears. And suddenly, everyone realizes something fundamental is about to change. The first sign that something had changed didn't come from me. It came from my calendar. One Tuesday morning, an email arrived confirming the final interview for a role I had been discussing with another company. They specialized in building operational systems for large international projects. Exactly the kind of work I had quietly been doing already. 2 days later, they made an offer. The conversation was simple, professional, calm. They weren't hiring me to assist someone else's system. They were hiring me to design one. After a long walk that evening, I accepted. The next morning, I scheduled a short meeting with Daniel. There was no tension in the room when I told him. "I wanted to let you know I've accepted a position with another organization," I said. "My notice period will start this week." For a moment, he looked surprised. Then he smiled politely. "Well, congratulations," he said. "Where are you heading?" I told him the company name and the role. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That sounds more strategic," he said. "Yes," I replied simply. He nodded, still calm. "Of course, we'll need to transition your responsibilities," he added. "But since most of your work is documentation support, I'm sure the team can pick it up." I didn't correct him, I just nodded. Of course. Over the next few days, the news spread through the office. Most reactions were friendly. "Good for you. Sounds like a great opportunity. You'll do well there." No one seemed worried. From their perspective, the situation was straightforward. A support staff member was leaving. Someone else would take over the documentation. Projects would continue exactly as before. But quietly, something subtle began happening. People started asking more questions than usual. "Charlotte, where did we store the older reporting requirements again?" "Charlotte, do you remember which integration step happens after the compliance verification?" "Charlotte, can you walk me through the timeline structure one more time?" For the first time, I noticed a small change in tone, not panic, just uncertainty. Because when someone begins preparing to leave, People suddenly realize how often they relied on that person's memory, and sometimes that realization comes a little later than expected. My notice period was 4 weeks. At first, everything still felt routine. Daniel asked me to prepare a short transition document so the team could understand the structure of the project files. That was reasonable, and I agreed. But something interesting started happening during those weeks. People began opening the system themselves, not just asking me where things were, actually trying to navigate it. And that was when the confusion started appearing. One afternoon, a senior analyst stopped by my desk. "I'm trying to trace the compliance changes from October," he said. "But the timeline doesn't seem to match the reporting adjustments." "It does," I replied calmly. "You just need to check the linked meeting notes from the Thursday call that week." He blinked. "There are linked notes?" "Yes," I said, turning the screen slightly. "They're referenced in the integration index." He stared at the structure for a moment. "I didn't realize the system was this layered." I smiled politely. It grew over time. Moments like that began happening almost daily. Another teammate asked why certain compliance notes were stored in separate folders. Someone else struggled to trace the history of a client decision that had been discussed across 3 different meetings. Each time, I explained the structure patiently, but I could see the same quiet realization appearing again and again. The system wasn't difficult, but it required context. And context is something that can't be transferred instantly. A week later, Daniel called me into a short meeting. "I've been reviewing the documentation structure." "Aha," he said. I nodded. "It's more detailed than I realized." There was a pause. "Would you be open to staying on a bit longer to help with the transition?" he asked. The question wasn't desperate, just careful. I considered it for a moment. "My new role begins on the scheduled date," I said gently, "but I'll make sure everything is documented clearly before I leave." He nodded slowly. "Of course." The conversation ended politely, but something had shifted. For the first time, Daniel was looking at the system not as something that simply existed, but as something someone had built. And the realization had arrived at a difficult moment, because by the time people begin trying to fully understand a structure, sometimes the person who understands it best is already preparing to step away. My final week arrived quietly. By that point, the atmosphere in the office had changed in small but noticeable ways. People were spending more time inside the documentation system. Questions still came to me, but now they were often followed by longer pauses, while someone tried to understand how everything connected. No one was angry. No one blamed anyone. But the earlier confidence, the assumption that everything was simple, had softened. 2 days before my last day, Daniel asked if we could talk briefly. We sat in the same conference room where many of our project meetings had happened. He closed his laptop and looked at me for a moment. "I've been reviewing the documentation you built," he said. "I didn't realize how much of the project structure was organized through it." I nodded slightly. "It grew gradually," I replied. He leaned back in his chair. "I think I may have described your role too narrowly in the past," he said. There was no defensiveness in his voice, just reflection. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he added something that sounded almost like an apology, though he didn't use that word. "You made the project easier for everyone else to run." I smiled gently. "That was the goal." Another pause settled between us. "I wish we had recognized that earlier," he said. The sentence hung in the air for a moment, but there was no bitterness in the room, because by that point, the conversation wasn't about correcting the past. The situation had already moved forward. "I think the team will understand the system with time," I said. "It just takes patience." He nodded slowly. "I believe that." When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic resolution, no confrontation, just 2 people acknowledging something that had taken a long time to become visible. Sometimes recognition arrives late, not out of cruelty, just because people don't always look closely at the systems that make their work possible. And by the time they finally do, the person who built those systems may already be on their way somewhere new. A few months after leaving, my life looked very different, though not in a dramatic way. The new company didn't introduce me as support staff. They introduced me as the person responsible for operational systems design. On my first day, the leadership team asked me a simple question. How would you structure our internal knowledge system so projects remain clear even as they grow? It was the kind of question I had spent years quietly answering, just without being asked directly. So I did what I had always done. I listened first, Then I started mapping the structure. The difference was that here, people were curious about the process. They asked how decisions should be documented, how dependencies should be tracked, and how teams could navigate complex information without confusion. The work itself wasn't new, but the context was. Instead of maintaining a system that people assumed was simple, I was designing systems people wanted to understand. And that changed the experience completely. Sometimes, during quiet moments, I still think about my old team, not with resentment, just with perspective. They weren't cruel people. Most of them were thoughtful, intelligent professionals. They simply accepted a narrative that had been repeated often enough, that certain roles existed to support the work rather than shape it. And once a narrative like that settles in a workplace, it can take a long time for anyone to question it. Leaving didn't feel like revenge. It felt like alignment. The work I had always been doing finally matched the role people could see. If there's one thing I've learned from that experience, it's this. Sometimes the most important change in your life doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from placing yourself somewhere your work no longer has to remain invisible. When people hear stories about workplaces, they often expect something explosive at the end. A dramatic confrontation. A moment where someone is proven wrong in front of everyone. But real life rarely works that way. In my case, nothing collapsed when I left. The company continued. The project moved forward. The team gradually learned how to navigate the systems I had built. And that's exactly how it should be. Because the real point of this story was never about revenge. It was about something quieter. For a long time, I believed the best way to succeed was simply to work harder and hope people eventually noticed. But experience taught me something different. People don't always see the full value of something that works quietly in the background. Not because they're cruel, not because they're intentionally dismissive. Sometimes they just never stop to look closely. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can keep trying to convince people to see what they've already decided not to notice. Or you can step into an environment where your work doesn't need to fight for visibility. For me, the second option changed everything. Today, when I design systems for new teams, I remember something important from those years. The strongest structures in any organization are often built by people who aren't standing at the front of the room. And sometimes the only way those structures become visible is when the person maintaining them finally moves on. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated your role, only realizing its importance after you were gone?